He did his master's and PhD from the Wisconsin-Madison University. In 1990 was the PhD basically. He is currently a professor in the Penn State University, and I leave the stage for Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I apologize if you're at the IIT Madras workshop, there'll be some overlap with the talk. So this is a little longer talk, but there's some overlap in the material. So let me just start very briefly by saying, what I work on. But this is not what I'm going to talk about mostly today. But just to give you an idea, if you want to talk to me about this later on. So I do, a lot of the work that I do is historically on different types of machine learning. I started out working on neural networks. Now that paper gets cited in the context of deep learning, but I don't do deep learning. Recent work has focused on causal inference, some work on knowledge representation, particularly some interesting problems that show up when you actually have multiple knowledge bases and you want to take some statements from one knowledge base and interpret it in the context of a different knowledge base. It requires some foundational work because it violates the single universe assumption. Then in terms of applications, most of my work over the last 10 years or so has focused on bioinformatics, molecular networks, macromolecular interactions, and so on. Since I moved to Penn State recently, I've started working in health informatics and some work on brain. So you might wonder, what is this craziness, right? So all of these topics that seem somewhat unrelated, but the rationale and the reason I got into computer science to begin with was I was interested in the brain. I couldn't see myself doing any wet lab work, so I gravitated towards modeling, computation, and studied artificial intelligence. So the key is that computation is the best formalism that we have for describing how information is processed and acquired and used by systems, whether they happen to be brains or genomes or computers that we have on our desks. So that's the unifying theme. And so we look at algorithms as theory. So if you want to have a theory of learning, you want to develop an algorithm that learns, however you want to characterize what learning means. If you want to have a theory of protein folding, you want to come up with an algorithm that takes a single linear sequence of amino acids and turns it into a three-dimensional structural description. Right? So it's algorithms as theory. So that's sort of the unifying theme. And here's a bunch of students and collaborators. So in terms of machine learning, these are some of the, so it started out with constructive neural network algorithms and then a variety of different problems in machine learning, learning grammars, probabilistic graphical models, more recently spatiotemporal data, some theoretical work on learnability under different classes of distributions. So that's just to give you a flavor of the types of work. And recently, causal inference, and at the end of the talk, I might spend some time on this. And here's some work on the applied stuff where it actually results in tools that various people use to solve their problems. So this is some range of things in bioinformatics. Okay, so today, instead, I'm going to give a different talk. So it's a three-part talk. So first part is sort of data sciences, and it's a perspective on, there's a lot of hype around big data, there's a lot of hype around data science, there's a lot of work on machine learning, but there are some areas that are not being paid attention to, and they're going to come back to bite us. Okay, so this is really sort of a perspective on what's missing, and maybe some of us should be working on those. So that's the first part of the talk. And then the second part, I'll try to relate some of this to brain sciences, and that if there is time at the end, I will really give a slightly more technical portion of the talk, which is on causal inference. Okay? So the first part of this talk is really based largely on a white paper that Computing Community Consortium asked us to do. It's available. You can check this up, and it's really a group that's looking at different areas of computing and trying to identify where the gaps are. Okay, so the current interest in data science is largely driven by the so-called big data, right? This is probably preaching to the choir. Most of you know why that's happening. There's advances in instruments of observation. There's increasing automation of data acquisition, and more recently, even data management and data analysis. So there is a variety of data, and this is happening in a variety of fields. And the challenges of this big data are in fact real. So for example, this is already old. We do have a $1,000 genome sequence. It might get $100 at some point in time. And so you can basically sequence everybody's genome, right? But having the genome, and there was this expectation that having the genome sequence would lead to advances in personalized medicine and so on, but that hasn't been borne out. And the large part, it's because actually interpreting the genome is much more difficult than we thought, and so we just still don't have an understanding of this. And the problem is made more complicated because even in this domain of genomics, there are over 1,000 different databases that might have a bearing on interpreting a single genome. And there is over 1 million new biomedical journal articles published per year. And so even if you are a specialist in a particular field, trying to keep on top of what's relevant in a single, in the context of a research question that you're trying to answer is extremely challenging. So the challenges are real. And the opportunities offered by this are also real, right? So there's a variety of areas where if you had the right kind of data with the right type of analysis, you can make an impact. And there is, and these are some of the challenges have to do with data management and data analytics, which are two areas that have received a lot of attention recently, right? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Not to say that that's not important. There's a lot being done there, and there's a lot more to be done. Okay, so but I want to take a step back. Data science is about really answering some fundamental questions in some scientific domains. So if it's, we saw some examples of talks about the brain this morning, but the same story could be told about virtually any domain. So you have some way of gathering data. You want to build a model. You want to generate hypotheses. Hypotheses make predictions, and these lead to additional experiments, and all of this is done in the context of some background knowledge. So this is sort of a prototypical cartoon of how science is done, right? So most of the work in big data or data science has focused on this part, basically machine learning, which is given a data set, you want to build a model, okay? Let's say we completely automate that. We accelerate that as much as possible with all the computing power we have and everything else. But as long as these other steps are not handled at the same rate, you're going to have a bottleneck. So science, the $1,000 genome sequence might still take a lot of effort to interpret, right? So just because I build a predictive model here doesn't mean I addressed all these questions. So, if you fall asleep after lunch, if you want to remember one thing, what I want to argue for is that we need to be paying much more attention to these other quadrants. Okay? All right. There's been, again, a lot of statements made about the availability of data. So for example, there's this article, it's sort of a popular source, Wired magazine, but similar things have been said in more scientific venues as well, right? So here's a claim: petabytes allow us to say correlation is enough. We can stop looking for models. You just take the data set and throw it at the biggest computers you have, and out of that come these insights, right? And correlation supersedes causation, and basically it's big data is supposed to end all need for theory or models. Okay, nothing could be farther from truth. Okay? So I can come up with this is something I found on the web, but there's many examples like this, right? So you can just because you find some correlation doesn't mean that there is some fundamental thing going on. Here's another one. So if you want to avoid deal with global warming, you should all become pirates, because there's a correlation between the reduced number of pirates and the increase in global warming. Here's another one. If you want to save lives, eliminate scientific funding, right? So there's all kinds of crazy correlations that you can find. And all of this, a lot of our machine learning algorithms, in fact, find them. That doesn't mean that they are real or they're meaningful or they're useful. Okay? And it's also, on the other side, you can actually have true causation and yet detect no correlation. This story is a little bit more complicated. If you're interested in it, talk to me later. Okay? So, and if you make incorrect causal inference, it could have serious consequences, not only in science, but in also everyday life. So this is actually a real case. Happened in 1996. Sally Clark's first son died due to a sudden infant death syndrome. Her second son died in 1999, also presumably because of the same thing, sudden infant death syndrome. And the prosecutors charged her with murder on the grounds that both deaths were too unlikely to be due to SIDS. And the rationale, the argument that was given by actually a statistician was that if you look at the number of infant deaths, the chance of a sudden infant death, somebody dying from that is 1 in roughly 8,500. So if there were 2 deaths in the same family, the chance is 1 over 8,000 squared. And this is too unlikely to have happened by chance, so Sally must have murdered her kids. Okay? But it turns out that there is a strong genetic component to sudden infant death syndrome. So these two things are not independent. So if you actually had some causal understanding of how this works, then you would have come to a different conclusion. Now, fortunately for Sally, the case was appealed, and eventually things came around, and she was actually released. Okay, so getting causality wrong has serious consequences. Okay, so we could sort of go back and try to get a lesson from physics, more established science. Right? So in many other domains, like life sciences, are sort of at the stage where physics was maybe 200 years ago. Tycho Brahe spent a lot of time gathering extremely accurate measurements of astronomical measurements, positions of stars and planets. For his time, it was certainly big data. Johannes Kepler worked with Tycho Brahe. Some even say that he maybe stole data from Tycho Brahe. But anyway, so he fit a variety of models, basically what we do in machine learning today, and did big data analytics of that time and came up with some interesting relationships. But we had to wait till Isaac Newton and Leibniz to invent calculus, so we had a language to talk about things like basic physical quantities before you could have Newton's laws of motion and some fundamental understanding of physics. Okay, so currently a lot of the emphasis on big data is in this space. We're not doing enough in this space, so that's just the point. Okay, so scientific studies typically start with a question, right? You heard a couple of talks this morning. They had a clear question that they were asking. One was about the noise and the tuning of neurons in the auditory cortex. And then, but what question to ask in the era of big data when you have 1 million publications a year in just biomedical sciences? What is a good question to ask, right? So in order to ask a good question, you need to know something about the field. You need to have the right skills, and you need to know something about the observations and experimental manipulations that might be possible. And then eventually you have to use that, get the data, and actually interpret the results, right? So, and most of these problems, right, except for given a data set, build a model part, are currently unaddressed. And as long as they remain unaddressed, you will have this bottleneck. You will not have solved the problem, right? So, this is again a cartoon. Nobody should feel offended by this. It's all science is either stamp collecting or physics, said Rutherford. And calculus provided the essential language for physics. And if one were being a little bit facetious, I could argue that data revolution is essentially an exponential growth in the size and the variety of stamp collections that we have. Data are stamps, right? Nothing wrong with that. Stamps are beautiful, and there's a lot to be done in organizing them, etc. But collecting stamps doesn't necessarily mean you understand what's going on. Computing revolution has been great, but what does it allow us to do? For the most part, it allows us to process this, right? Organize them, label them, structure them, and so on. And the connectivity revolution allows us to share all these wonderful stamp collections. So we have large data banks like the Protein Data Bank, similar efforts elsewhere. Right, and most of data science has focused primarily on this part, collecting, management, and some analysis. But we have a long way to go in terms of making the leap from quote-unquote stamp collecting to physics, or from a descriptive science to a predictive science in life sciences. So for example, if you want to cure cancer, you want to understand the mechanism. If you want to improve learning, you want to understand how people learn. Those kinds of questions we are a long way from answering. Okay? So if you look at biology, right, it's traditionally, again, this is changing rapidly, but traditionally it's been closer to stamp collecting than physics, right? So you gather the data and maybe have some qualitative understanding of it. And recent years have seen an acceleration in the data collection, and similar thing is being played out in other fields. Right, so here's some food for thought. Right, so I wouldn't even dare to put this slide up, except for the fact that it was actually came out of an article written by a biologist. So I'm always scared to put this up in front of biologists. Right? So the title of the article was, "Can a Biologist Fix a Radio?" And then it sort of goes on to talk about how biology has been traditionally done. Right? So, so you create a parts list. You figure out, what the parts are. In the case, if you're trying to understand radio, you take it apart and look at the parts, and then you describe the parts. And if you're lucky, you might perturb the system in some way. You don't really know what variables are the right variables to perturb. So if you're trying to understand radio, you found some transistors in that. You might see if it's color matters or if size matters, whatever you can manipulate. You'll try to do that. And out of that comes some kind of a story. And at the end of the day, you haven't understood how radio works, right? Because you don't know. Okay. So, so this is a problem. But there's a variety of data in biology, and similar things are happening in neuroscience. So you get connectivity data. In the case of biology, it might be protein interaction networks. In the case of brains, it is brain connectivity. You get activity data. In the case of genomics, it's gene expression. In the case of brains, it's brain activity. You sometimes, if you're lucky, you might also get perturbation data. This is a technique for manipulating single cells. You bombard them with different chemicals and see what the response is. Right? You might do the same thing with neurons. So what's missing? Well, there are a number of things missing, right? So first, you need something to make sense of the data. It's to state your assumptions, state your questions, formulate theories. So you need a counterpart of a calculus for physics. Okay? So and being a computer scientist, I would argue that we have the beginnings of this, right? Because algorithms, are general. So if you believe Church-Turing thesis, anything that can be described by an algorithm, and therefore algorithms should be able to take the place of calculus in some way in these domains. But then you need all of these other pieces. And so if you just focus on the modeling language, and if you look at, let's say, macromolecular networks, so this is the kind of cartoon that you might find in an article in molecular biology, where this is the sort of verbal description that goes with it. There's a number of genes that code for some proteins, and proteins, a couple of proteins bind together to form a complex that activates the expression of some other gene, and that when that gene product is produced, the protein C inhibits the expression of some other genes, and so a story like this, right? But unfortunately, this, a person, a trained biologist can understand this and do something with it, but machines really cannot. Right? So you need something that actually has a little bit more formal semantics behind it before machines can work with this. So you can try to abstract this out into some models, and here's one cartoon. Right, from the same system, you might just model the protein-protein interactions. Nodes represent proteins, edges represent interactions between proteins. Basically, protein A binds to protein B, and then you might do various types of analysis, topological analysis, and so on to try to figure out some properties of these networks. So that's one example. You might, if you're ambitious, you might go a step further. You might put directions on those links that you had in the graph. And then you can ask a richer set of questions, right? So you can ask, well, is there any possible way in which gene C could influence the activity of gene D, right? So that's just a path query through this graph. So is there some path, a directed path in this network? And there are other kinds of questions that you can ask. If you're more ambitious, you might go and start really putting some functions on these nodes and say how the activity of one of these influences the activity of something else through some logical function or some other kind of nonlinear function, and then you have some closer to a mechanistic understanding of it. Or if you want to be really ambitious, you might actually want to write down the differential equations that govern the dynamics of this network. So all of these are models of the same system. Each kind of model allows you to ask a different class of questions. And furthermore, if you go through this, you can look at this as a hierarchy with the undirected graphical model as basically the most abstract. And then at every level, I add some more detail. And consequently, there has to be some consistency between these levels. So if the undirected graph has to be consistent with this directed graph, the directed graph has to be consistent with the one that's a Boolean network. The Boolean network should approximate in some way the behavior of the differential equation system. Right? So we need these models at multiple levels of abstraction, and this is necessary whether you're working with brains or molecular systems. So, you can think of algorithms then as theories in this context, and the same sort of story can be played out in many different fields, right? And in order to play this game, you need computational abstractions of the domain. So I just gave you some examples of such an exercise in the case of molecular networks. If you're going to do this with brains, you need similar things. If you're going to do this with any other domain, you need this. And some of this has happened in our field, and some of you might be familiar with this line of work. So there's evolution, Holland and Valiant's work provided computational abstractions of evolution. If you want to study rationality, Ruff Garden's work provides that. If you want to study social networks, Kleinberg and others have done this. And learning, Valiant, many others. So we need computational abstractions. So you cannot just work with data without some sort of a model. So that's point number one. And then you need background knowledge and expertise. And of course, this is very hard to get, right? And some of this is buried in the literature. So one can imagine a lot of work that could be done by people that work on text analysis and so on to try to extract and organize what we know about some particular field, okay, so that it could then be used for the exercise of model building. We need a process for constructing models, assessing models, generating explanations, generating hypotheses. And ultimately, any science, there is no truth, right? Everything is a successive approximation of something else, a slightly better explanation. of something. So we also need methods for designing, planning, and executing experiments under a variety of constraints. So if you know that certain variables can be manipulated, some experiments are more costly than others, some can be feasible, some are not because of ethical or technical reasons. So you need algorithms that can identify optimal experiments that could be run in a setting. So and this background information may include assumptions, some cases knowledge, beliefs, hypotheses, process descriptions of various sort. Most of the time these are partial, often inconsistent, ambiguous, uncertain, while the problems of representation, retrieval, inference, etc. Have been receiving a lot of attention in the case of data. Not as much attention has been paid to the same sort of analogous problems in the case of knowledge or hypothesis and so on. So you need formal representations of those that we can manipulate. So now let's just focus on the model construction piece, which is maybe the part that is maybe more well studied. Even there are significant gaps. So for example, if you want to build a model, model could be going from X to Y, right? So you have some observations, two sets of observations, you want to relate them. So you might build a model from knowledge that you have. So for example, if you understand physics that has, deductively you can infer things about a system and you can build a model like that. Or you can also build models from observations, machine learning, causal inference fit in this. Or you can do this using experimental data where causal inference plays a role. Okay? So when you look at the work on models, most of the machine learning work, and there's a variety of it, and the field has literally exploded in the last 10 years or so, all of them basically take advantage of large amounts of data, have some class of models, whether they are Bayesian networks, decision trees, or support vector machines, linear hyperplanes, or grammars, some class of models, and they fit the data. And there are various ways of fitting, there are various ways of evaluating how good the fit is, and that's sort of the state of affairs. And if you look at the work in data analysis or machine learning, applied machine learning, you pick a off-the-shelf algorithm like a support vector machine or Bayesian network. You have a data set, you apply it to that, and out comes a model, right? So you might, so if you applied support vector machines to gene expression data, you might figure out that if you have the expressions of some genes, that would predict the expression of some other gene using some complex black box model. But if you take that model to a biologist, there's nothing they can do with it, right? Because it doesn't suggest a concrete experiment. It's hard to understand. It just does the prediction. Right? So if you need to, if you want this model to inform biology, then you need to be able to express this model in a language that's closer to what a biologist would understand. Right? So they understand molecular interactions in terms of these labeled graphs. This gene upregulates this other gene. This gene, in combination with this, downregulates something else. So you need to be able to come up with models from data that are expressible in a language that is close to the, what's prevalent in the domain, so that a bench biologist can take that model and figure out what's a good experiment to run. Otherwise, we are just doing this exercise in basically a fancy version of curve fitting, and that's useful in some context, but it's not really solving the scientific problem. So there is a gap here. Data mining permits the use of off-the-shelf algorithms, but at the same time, it introduces a big language gap between model builders who use machine learning and the model users, the scientists in the domain. So if you want to address that gap, then we need to come up with methods that would build models that are not only accurate but also comprehensible, They can be used to generate explanations. They can be communicated with to other people, machines, scientists, and they have to be consistent. So you might come up with a model that goes from X to Y, but it actually violates the known laws of physics. Then that's not a very useful model, right? And it needs to lead to testable hypotheses, models that span these multiple levels of abstraction. So if you come up with a model with directed graphs for molecular networks, that has to be consistent with the level above and the level below. Right? So this leads to an entire research agenda for people in machine learning to sort of focus their energies, at least some of their energies, on this class of problems, where you take a domain, understand what the modeling requirements are, and come up with algorithms that would construct these models from data set in a form that can actually lead to testable predictions. Okay. And we need better ways to assessing models. The standard thing that we look at is predictive accuracy. And again, if it's a black box model, that's not very meaningful. We have to think about explanatory part. Does it explain something that we didn't already know? Is it consistent with all the other things we know, right? So the Newtonian physics, if it's an approximation of something more complicated, then there has to be some way of relating those two. So there are these multiple levels of abstraction, and you have to have some way of evaluating complex models in that context. And again, formalizing these, I think, is a nice research agenda. And so again, similar things, defining the space of experiments that are doable, right, worth doing. Specifying preferences over the space of experiments. Maybe some are unethical, some are impossible to run. Choosing experiments based on how much information that they actually give you to throw light on a problem. And then planning those experiments, executing those experiments, monitoring them along the way so that actually they work the way you expected. Documenting experiments. So we need formal languages for documenting experiments so that machines can read and understand those experimental descriptions, replicating experiments, and so on. So, in order for this to work on a large scale, you also need shareable representations of what I call broadly scientific artifacts. We have more or less figured out how to do this part. Right? There's much more data sharing, at least in some domains. So there are gene bank, protein data bank, and so on, right, with standardized representations. But we need the same sorts of things for experimental protocols. If somebody has to interpret your data, they need to know how it was gathered. It's not just enough to have the data. Similarly, for analysis tools, models, workflows, and so on. And as science becomes increasingly collaborative, you also need to impose on top of it some kind of organizational structure, so that if you have a complicated problem, you want to know what is the right set of people that you want to assemble so that you can go after that problem. You only have part of the expertise, right? So that leads to a bunch of other problems. Okay. So so this is, in order to address the gaps, we need to do all of this. And there are some examples, right, of exercises along these lines. So this is a work that was on robot scientists that came out some time ago from Ross King's group. It sort of took on this scientific discovery problem in a limited setting where they were working with yeast samples. But every step was automated. Okay? Every step from sort of formulating the hypothesis to gathering the data to analyzing the data and building the model, testing it, except it was in a very restricted setting. So maybe that's not feasible in general, but perhaps we can think about basically using artificial intelligence techniques to augment human expertise in various ways, right? So you can imagine AI systems that sort of watch over your shoulder and know what you're interested in, finds and reads the relevant literature. So there's been progress on machine reading, information extraction, and so on. based on that ingests available knowledge and data, and then helps you, take the next steps. And these kinds of tools are going to be increasingly necessary in light of this explosion in the data and the literature and so on. And here's another example, and many examples like this. The more in the report you can take a look at. But to conclude this part of the talk, right? So all science is either stamp collecting or physics, said Rutherford. And big data, if I were to make a caricature of it, it's a cartoon, so don't be offended, is basically spectacular stamp collections. So if you want to go, and big data does not mean the demise of the scientific method. As I argued, you need, in fact, more attention to the scientific method, much more careful attention to the scientific method, because now you have to write everything down precisely so that the machines can use that information, right? So we need to address two broad areas. One is computational abstractions in relevant, that are relevant to particular domains, so that you can actually do this using algorithms, and then cognitive tools that basically extend the human intellect. All right, so and this would mean really there's room for work across a variety of fields, not just computer science, and a lot more needs to be done. So let me now switch to the second part of the talk very briefly. So addressing the the aspects of brain science. So here again, so to keep things in perspective, there's been always a very tight connection between computation, brain, and data science. So, going back to the very early days, right? In fact, the history of computer science, artificial intelligence, and brain science are deeply intertwined. And computer science was born really with the Turing's formalization of what it means to have an effective procedure, right? And later work showed the equivalence of alternative computing paradigms. And McCullough and Pitts in 1943, Pitts was a student of Reshevsky in Chicago at one point, where they were developing these mathematical models of cellular systems. And they, after having seen Turing's work, they set out to study computational properties of simple model of a neuron, the so-called threshold neuron, which we still use today for building pattern classifiers, right? And the relationship between computers and the brain, based on the understanding of brains at that time, was actually attempted by von Neumann. And the artificial intelligence as a field was born in 1956, and Herb Simon in 57 predicted that most psychological theories and by inference brain would take the form of some kind of a computer program, right? So this was sort of the working hypothesis of AI. It's also the working hypothesis of computational neuroscience to some degree. And then Rosenblatt showed how this McCullough-Pitts neuron can learn to classify patterns. So support vector machine is just a fancier iteration of that linear classifier. Okay, and David Marr in 1976 proposed that the brain could be studied at least 3 interrelated levels. The first question is, what does brain compute? The next is, how does it compute it? Algorithmic understanding. So you say, well, it recognizes, it should recognize objects. That's a task level description. Algorithmic description is, how does it recognize objects? And the implementation is, how exactly? So how is it realized? How is this algorithm implemented in the brain? Or if it is, it could be implemented in general purpose hardware. How is it implemented on a regular computer? Right? So different implementations could have different trade-offs. So, and this debate about whether brains are general purpose computers or not, I think one can argue that with appropriate augmentation, they are at least as powerful as Turing machines, general purpose machines. For example, if you think of a brain that's built of essentially these McCullough-Pitts neurons, which take weighted sum of the inputs and threshold them, and produce an output of 1 if those weighted sum exceeds the threshold and 0 otherwise, you can take such a device, and by choosing appropriate weights, you can make them compute logical AND, ORs, and NOTs. And once you have logical AND, OR, and NOT, you can assemble any Boolean function, and once you can assemble any Boolean function, all you need is delays. You can implement finite state machines, and once you have finite state machines, all you need is some space to read and write on, and which is what we have: books, blackboards, etc. So you can build arbitrarily powerful computers. So there's an existence proof. Okay, so brains, if given, so even if brains were made of such simple devices, and in this morning we saw plenty of evidence that they are, even a single neuron can compute much more than what I just showed you here. So obviously they can do general purpose computation. It's just that maybe the trade-offs are different, right? The substrate on which brain does computation is very different from the substrate on which these computers implement them. The implementation constraints are different, and that leads to different, maybe some computations are more efficient in one implementation than in the other. Okay. So what does computer science have to do with brain science? I mean, we can think of computers as providing just tools for doing data analysis, but I think that's too restricted a view, right? Because there is a useful level of abstraction in which you can study brains. I mean, brains are devices that do information processing. It doesn't mean physics and chemistry are not important, but there are useful levels of abstraction. You can think of them as information processors. And if they are information processors, it's very legitimate to ask, what are the algorithms, and what are the properties of those algorithms, and how are they realized? Right? So once you take that view, then brains can be studied using that framework. And the advent of big data in brain sciences, so brain sciences have been a little bit behind genomics, right? So it's more recent phenomenon that we have this massive data in brain sciences. And you might have seen this picture. It came from an article from Sinowski and others. This essentially lays out the different spatial and temporal resolutions of the different measurement techniques. And you saw examples of some of them in this morning's talks. Given that, it might be useful to ask, what does it mean to understand the brain? Well, this answer to this question obviously depends on the level which you are asking this question, whether you're asking the question at the level of synapses or neurons or circuits or systems. But regardless of the level, you have to answer these questions in some way, right? And solutions at each level of analysis and organization must be compatible. So if I come up with an explanation of how neurons work, that has to be compatible with an explanation of how circuits work, and vice versa. Okay? So if we take this approach, the current strategy, right? So create a parts list, inventory of neuronal types, describe and classify these parts, properties of neurons, perturb the system and observe effects. You might ask, well, is this strategy sufficient for understanding how a brain works? And some people have argued that big data is all you need. If you have enough data, you do some analysis, and you're going to figure it all out, right? So there's an interesting article that Jonas and Coding wrote in 2016, I think in summer, that had the title, Could a Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor? I would revise this title. Instead of neuroscientist, I would actually put a data scientist there, because that's roughly the flavor of the article. Basically, if you were to use, and they used instead of a brain, which we don't really understand, some simpler system like a microprocessor, and use techniques of the sort that we are currently using in neuroscience, so measuring activity. So you can record from every transistor, every gate in the microprocessor. If you could do that, you have the equivalent to the whole brain activity map, right? So using the current techniques, could you figure out what this microprocessor is doing? I mean, in other words, what is it doing? What is it computing? And they had sort of 3 different games that were being played on the microprocessor, and that was the activity, the task. And you can get these measurements, and basically they did the analysis, and they concluded that you don't learn a whole lot about the microprocessor that way. Okay? So that should give us some pause. it doesn't mean we should stop everything that we are doing. It should give us some pause, because brain is much more complicated. We know a lot less about the brain than we know about the microprocessor. And, but the techniques we are using can't even figure out how a microprocessor works. So our data analysis methods are not sufficiently sophisticated. Our measurement tools are not sufficiently sophisticated. So, so we have to come up with better ways of doing that. So this comes to this big data fallacy, which is in the case of, this could be applied anywhere, but it's certainly true in brain science. And so I would argue, go back to the first part of the talk, we need a much more emphasis on hypothesis, experiments, and models. This is the sort of thing that a careful practicing neuroscientist would do. I mean, if you heard this morning's talks, they had clear hypotheses about what they were after. They had some sort of a model, and they got the data, and then they were able to draw the inferences. So you're not going to just take a massive brain scan in fMRI, hundreds of fMRI images, and suddenly figure out how the brain works. Okay. So this has led to many challenges. From data integration to analysis, and all of these need to be addressed. And so just a couple of things I want to emphasize. One is this is a famous quote in biology that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So if you are going to do this, then if you want to develop understanding, then we need to have at this basic level some way of taking findings across multiple species and organizing them in the evolutionary context. So for example, if you somebody talked about homology, I think it was the talk on attention between two different species. So you have to have those kinds of understanding to be able to sort of take findings in one species and being able to interpolate across others. There are many other challenges. This is a similar quote due to Gordon Sheffield, one of my heroes. I used his book when I took my neuroscience course when I was in graduate school, and even though I was studying computer science. So nothing in neuroscience makes sense except in light of behavior. So, and this is interesting, and here's an interesting opportunity as well. Most of the studies in neuroscience have concentrated on observing neural activity or in the context of very simple behaviors, if at all. Now, but with the advent of sensors and the ability to gather data, you should be able to study behavior in a much more realistic setting, right? Behaving animals. So what happens to your brain when you are not just remembering a list of 5 items, the classic cognitive psychology type experiment, but going about your life in a natural setting. So if you could do that, so for example, now it's increasingly feasible to gather brain activity data while the experimental subject engages in a not quite a naturalistic behavior, but richer set of behaviors than we previously had. And then we should have a better chance of trying to understand, because the experimental setups, if they're too restricted, what you learn in that setting may not generalize at all to a more naturalistic setting. Okay. So there's problems of data integration. This is much harder, I think, in neuroscience than it was in genomics. It is hard enough in genomics, it's much harder in neuroscience. Because in genomics, at least at some level, you're dealing with discrete data, genomic sequences, with cell types and physiology, et cetera. Things get much more complicated. And then there are data analysis challenges, right? And in the time that is, so essentially to conclude this part of the talk, it's a fallacy to believe that advances in neuroscience are limited only by data. Of course, to some extent they are limited by data, but they are not limited only by data. We need to address these kinds of questions in order to have any real hope of being able to understand the brain. And I had to put this up because we hear so much about deep neural networks, right? So almost any machine learning problem you talk to people at Google, the first response would be deep neural networks do it. They don't quite address this problem, and this is something that's worth addressing, as I pointed out. But more importantly, it's in the context of brain. If you look at a problem like this, right? So if I want to, if I could record activity from the multiple visual areas, say V1, V2, V3, lateral geniculate nucleus, and V4, and I build a support vector machine or some other complicated or deep neural network model that takes activity here and predicts activity in V4. Okay? So what does it tell me about how the brain works? Well, it tells me that these data can predict it, if in fact I can predict it, but it doesn't tell me anything more. Right? So, so what we need is a model that actually gets at some mechanistic understanding of it. And that's an area of machine learning where a lot more needs to be done. And I would argue that looking at causal inference, where there is some machinery being developed, thanks in large part to work of Yuda Pearl and others, that allows us to begin to get at that. It's not a solved problem. There's a lot more to be done. So just to use a few minutes to, I won't get into the technical details. If you're interested, you can talk to me later. But just to sort of differentiate the standard sorts of things we do in machine learning from causality. So this is what we do in machine learning. Everything that we do in machine learning can be seen in this context in some way. You have some underlying probability distribution that generates the data. And I build a model that somehow captures different aspects of that probability distribution, maybe the conditional probabilities, x given, probability of y given x, and then I can use this to make predictions. So this is the sort of thing that we do in machine learning. Okay, in the case of causal inference, we are looking at a qualitatively different problem, a more general problem. So there's a joint distribution that generates the data, but then I can manipulate this process in some way. So for example, I can knock out some gene and see what happens, right? And so for example, if I want to know what happens to cancer if we ban smoking, this question cannot be answered using the joint distribution alone, right? Because the joint distribution will give me something like conditional probability of cancer given smoking or not smoking. But that's not the same thing as eliminating smoking, right? Because you really eliminate a link between the two things. And it requires actually a new language to be able to talk about that. So these two things are not the same. So if this changes p to p hat when I have the manipulation, so in this p hat, the probability of smoking being absent is actually 1 because I banned smoking. Nobody can smoke anymore. And once I have that, this p hat, p prime of cancer is not same as this thing. Okay? So observing not smoking is not same as preventing smoking. And so, so we need a language for this, and Yuda Pearl's work has led to something that allows us to answer these kinds of questions. And you can have these graphical models of this kind that try to capture your causal assumptions, and then you can look at the change. So for example, if there's a link, this is smoking and cancer, if there's a link, if I ban smoking, that link goes away, and then you can study the rest, how the conditional probabilities change. Based on this, there is a number of problems that come up. If you find a relationship, let's say in a controlled experimental setting, let's say the model organism like primate, does the finding transfer to humans? Okay? We now have the machinery to begin to answer those questions, and more work needs to be done. And if you want to address the problems that we talked about earlier, it's really necessary to look at causality much more seriously in the context of machine learning. Okay, since I'm out of time, I'll stop here and take questions.
Sir?
Yeah.
Many thanks for the informative talk. So, what would you suggest for a student like me working on the problem of big data?
So, I mean, I would say there's a lot of work being done in certain corners of this space. So, if you want to actually have an impact, look at areas that are not already well trodden. Right, so there's a tendency to sort of gravitate towards problems that everybody else. So right now, everybody wants to work on deep neural networks. Nothing wrong with deep neural networks. I think they're beautiful things to study, but there's a lot more out there than that. So go into some areas, and that's why I shifted my focus to causality about 3 years ago, because not enough people are doing it. It's basically Yuda Pearl and some of his former students, which is a really tiny group. There's huge problems in that space. And if you go into areas that are not well covered, you're more likely to have an impact. Identify some good problems to work on. I hope that answers your question.
I have a sort of I guess, a mild counterposition, and I would be interested to hear your reaction to it. So I actually take exception to Conrad's paper from this summer, the one about could we understand a microprocessor, because I think of the way, or rather the analogy between that and can we understand the brain, which is what he's really asking. Because the nature of the computation and the nature of the computational engine is fundamentally different, at least in mammalian cortex. So it may apply to something like C. elegans, but our brains are extremely noise tolerant. They're extremely tolerant of loss of components,
right,
which is not true of a microprocessor at all.
Right.
And so one of the sort of things one can infer from that is that it seems very likely that the relevant computational variables, the ones that would be implementing the algorithm that would be the kind of calculus part of physics, don't belong to single components, to single neurons, but rather to the circuit as a whole. And as far as I can tell, the only way that we're going to be able to take recordings of large numbers of neurons and see through to those computational variables will be data-driven approaches. So it seems to me that data-driven approaches will be fundamental. They won't be the whole story by any means,
that's
right?
all I'm saying. So I think, I don't want to overstate the case, right? So sometimes you have to make these things into cartoons to kind of make a point. So the point I was trying to make is not that data-driven approaches are not important. I mean, incredibly important. If you don't have data, you have, you only have mathematics. You don't have science, right? I mean, you need to have data. My point was simply that, let's not put all of the emphasis on the data part, right? Because even if you, this morning's talks that were, sort of neuroscience talks, right? There was much more than data, but a lot of that was in their heads. I mean, the head of the person that's doing the, reasoning. I mean, the neuroscientists come up with this hypothesis because you know about all these things. I mean, that's wonderful. But what's happening is that in many of these domains, right? So somebody comes out of machine learning or some other field like that, right? Data analysis. They look at this as just a data set, and that's dangerous. You need to understand the process that generated the data. If you don't have a clue about what was used to get that data, you shouldn't be working on that data, right? Because you can make horrible mistakes.
I guess in a way, I think we're coming from a domain of time where we're spending a lot of time not looking at data, spending a lot of time focusing on interpreting individual neurons. I think one of the huge leaps of progress we've made is to stop worrying about interpreting single neurons.
Right.
Think about what the whole circuit is doing.
No, that's very valuable. I mean, I have no problem with that. So, take a systems view of things, and then that's great. But that also means that there are many more challenges, right? So fitting data from a single neuron is a lot easier than trying to understand signals from a population of neurons, right?
let's thank Professor Honavar.